these technologies. But all this relational accountability and technology, the question of technology, relies on a critical aspect of knowledge generation. We need to generate knowledge in order to create the governance blueprint, the policies that will help us govern those ecosystems. And how do we do it more equitable, more transparent, more traceable? And probably you're tired of hearing the word trust. How do we build trust between communities and the investors and the stakeholders? And the goal, what is the goal of this? And often the goal is profit. No matter which way you slice it, this pie, the goal is profit. Or at least that's what is being discussed. So if knowledge is important to have two things, to have evidence-based policies, well, then we need to ask, what kind of knowledge? Whose knowledge? How is knowledge being produced and controlled? Right? If that is to be used the basis for governance, then we need to ask the question. And then finally, at the very end, we start thinking about, well, we have knowledge, we have technology, we have the governance. Now we need to think about the agreements. What is our shared diplomatic benefits that we're discussing? And as I say, Indigenous Commons it has created this panarch of looking over this, to thinking about, if we are to utilize technology, and we need to utilize technology, and we need to utilize it in a way that is a tool. Technology is a tool. Is not a silver bullet that will solve our problems. And that's the problem with the language. You see how the language distorts reality, creates hallucinogenic ideas of artificial intelligence is for nature. It gives the sense that the algorithms will jump out your computer and go do gardening and take care of your baby, take your children to school, do the farming, do the laundry, bring food from the farm to the grocery store, cook for you, feed you, as you are just sitting in a chair as the god of this masterpiece of artificial intelligence. And that's a hallucinogenic view of the techno-solutionism that we have entered. So we just need to read papers, media, but also the technological sector that gives this hallucinogenic language, AI for good. Which good? Who's good? How are we defining really good? Is it good for the societies in which they are making profit? Or is it good for the societies from which we depend on the minerals? That's where treaties are so important, this diplomatic benefit negotiation. And we have been doing in Indigenous Commons this architecture. And every time I bring the word infrastructure, people ask me, like, is this a bridge? We're building the next San Francisco iron bridge. No, that's not architecture. That is an infrastructure, a solid, tangible infrastructure. What we are building is infrastructure, meaning the language designed, the governance architecture in which we can build relational accountability, through which we can apply protocols, through which we ground truth and socially validate how we are to use technology. And a case in point, as Jason was mentioning, the many other speakers in this series started when Bande, when Andre, when Eman, and they didn't put a geographic location, but Bante is in Africa. It's in a very specific corner of Africa, doing amazing work for children to rethink economics, to rethink spirituality, to rethink renaturalization of their own cultures. Why? Well, because we have built the infrastructure to start thinking, speaking, sharing lessons, experiences, and the undeniable fail and trail and learning aspect of this. We need to try and fail. It's a trial and error and a learning curve that we are going here. When Andre in the United States looking into how do we make communities around Massachusetts resilient, how should they adapt, mitigate, regenerate ecosystems in order to survive? And that has been the architecture of Indigenous Commons, thinking about when we think about technology, we shouldn't be thinking about technology as being a speak, as a AI, as I'm putting as an example, or biotechnology. Social technology is a instrumental element that we need to build. Biocultural assets we need to be built in order to exchange fairly and create those ecosystems. And then in Latin America, when me connected to Latin America and Indigenous Commons, we are building what that looks like, what will look if we are now to talk about economics and finance, or many of you probably more familiar with nature, climate, finance, ecosystems, when COP16 making millions of dollars pledges. The one thing that they don't discuss is how it will be governed. Who will have access to it? How do we measure impact? How do we ensure really that we are really benefiting the wealth and the health of the community? How is that we are ensuring that we are not doing a Cobra effect? Meaning there is very good, well-intentioned technological applications right now in the Andes and in the Amazon that has created conservation parks, national parks. Those things has created that communities has had to leave their territory into urban ecosystems. That's a major migration, immigration pattern that now urban cities that were not adapted to the amount of population that is increasing has to deal. That's another catastrophe right there. The other thing is that internationally, we will see an increment of immigration taking place. Many cities are not built to support more human populations. Sometimes the technology that we utilize in, like we have used remote sensing, camera traps, acoustics, environmental DNA, we are using to monitor biodiversity, and that's good. We need to monitor, we need to understand these things. Then we need to ask the question, who will protect these ecosystems? How the protection will take place? How they will be financially sovereign through doing these things? We are more focused into the problem. We need to protect biodiversity. Who will do it? Nobody has a real answer. Who will do it? COP13, it mentions about this piece over here, this piece that I will say, and spoiler alert. I think many reports has done this. Is indigenous knowledge and indigenous people are a centerpiece for resilience in our climate change. But are we really thinking about they will be compensated for the work that they're doing? We do not know how exactly that will happen. But then we're forgetting many small farmers, middle-scale farmers. We're forgetting rural areas that also participate in conservation. We're forgetting them as key elements and players of that. So in Indigenous Commons, what we have started doing as a general topic, and I will stop when this to open it up so more questions and conversation, is a panarch to think about the infrastructures of how do we create relationship with the contemporary technologies that's coming in? How do we really restructure on the ground biocultural innovation and technologies that is already solving the problem? So if we use artificial intelligence to trace and track funding per se, well, it shouldn't be about removing people. It should be about supporting the work that people are doing. So how do we use that technology in relationship, in the context, in the cultural value that has been doing for so much? So we have been doing this. And then we are thinking more and more the interface into we need knowledge. That is not a little endeavor. We need knowledge. We need a diverse type of knowledge. And the diverse type of knowledge right now, we're science, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic science right now does not know how to actually work when indigenous knowledge domains. So that's where the point of JSON and technology and treaties comes into hand, where we are looking into how do we standardize indigenous data? How do we standardize in a way that when it moves through the value supply chain of the data economy, communities are the authors and participants of the share that's benefiting through the knowledge. Indigenous data sovereignty is the arc from which we are departing, but inside there we are building indigenous economy data sovereignty, which means right now when we're talking about direct financing, we do not actually have a clear traceability and projection of how communities will manage their finance. And that has created two relics, two colonial relics. One is a financial literacy. We are asking, is communities financially literal? But that's the wrong question, because the question already is posing that is there financially literal to weird financial systems? And the answer is no. They are not literal to weird financial systems. They are literal and they are experts in their own assets and their own financial economic activities. Therefore, by creating our indigenous economy data sovereignty, we can standardize and we can what is unstructured structure it in a way that we can create a baseline traceability of how direct funding will look like in the hands of communities. Meaning, if the community are to help educate 20 indigenous people, well, that economy in the long run, it will exponentially grow because they will have a better conditions to jobs, to lives, to existence, versus we will spend $10,000 in planting 10,000 trees. That is a big difference in how we are right now tracing. We are giving communities only a artifact, trees, shovels, wheelbarrows, cements, and then we ask them, okay, now go build the bridge. How? That's
And
what I have.
Brother Navi, Waranavi, as we stand here connected by this river of unity, we know that Indigenous Commons is moving from theory to governance. So you speak of shareholdership of nature. As guardians, how do we ensure that we invite the world into this river? We remain the captains of the vessel. How do we lock in our sovereignty so that the flow of resources never washes away our authority?
You see, this is something that we haven't done carefully in indigenous negotiation ecosystems. When we bring indigenous people to projects, to negotiations, to policy, we have surprisingly selected leaders that are charming, leaders that are mostly cultural leaders, that they understand the cosmology, the worldviews of the community. But we haven't bring translational leaders or transsystems leaders, the generation that has gained levels of education and has go back and work with the community alongside cultural leaders. So many times when we see in Copter is a good example just to think about. Copter was called the Cup of Indigenous People, if you remember. That was the big announcement. The Cup of Indigenous People was called. Everything is gonna be different. Now we will have this thing nailed down. That's it, because this is indigenous people leading negotiations. There is hundreds of reports that indigenous people were not in the blue zone where the negotiations were taking place. Why? Well, because indigenous people that were in there, they are indigenous people that they are more connected, more linked, more understanding of their cultural worldview, that they understand to the system on which they are being negotiated. The embassy is already skewed. If we want to retain sovereignty, we we need actually a we do not need to go and negotiate over there. We need to negotiate under our own terms. That means what? We cannot only need to resist, because resistance has created since about, let me put a date, since about maybe 500 years ago, there is a little called obstacle to the nation state development. I don't know if you remember this. There is a beautiful literature for about 500 years that have been iterated over and over again in different things. And indigenous people are labeled as obstacles of development for in the nation. When we resist, we are bugs in that position. We say there are obstacles. So we need to find legal force, inhumane ways to go through the obstacle. The way that we hold sovereignty is that we resist through cultural leaderships, and we propose alternative negotiation points through the trans systems leaders. And this is where Indigenous Commons is enacting this space, this way of, as I was saying before, we are building the infrastructure. And that's the space where we want to engage when philanthropy, when policymakers, when private sector, in a sense that you are not bringing benefit. It's not about you are the benefit. No, it's about, do we agree with the project? It's a big difference when we start looking that way, because right now how finance is being looked, business is being looked, is we are the benefit. We are the benefit. I don't know what you guys talking about. We the benefit. You guys are just in our way. So to hold our sovereignty, we need to bring the trans system leaders to help really understand the ecosystem in which we are doing. And that understanding, what we'll end up doing is translational leaders can pull into the embassy of indigenous people, because it will be bringing the cultural leaders' understandings of the rule of law. And the rule of law actually comes from Elinor Armstrong's seminal work. I don't know if you know her. She's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. Just a little thing. I think that's something to be aware. Elinor Armstrong brought the idea that local communities, the institutions of local communities, they are the most effective, adapted, mitigating, and regenerative institutions to make something sustainable. And she did 4 case studies. Spain, First World nations in Spain, something in Switzerland and other First Nation, and then took that into Southeast Asia. And in all these corners, you find the same thing. So right now we are negotiating in disadvantage because we bring in only cultural leaders to talk about increased numbers. Increased numbers does not mean embassy, does not mean sovereignty, does not mean autonomy. Embassy means imagine a Thanksgiving parade in New York City. That's what increased numbers mean. They utilize indigenous people to make the justification for continuing in the same path, not to need to really change the colonial relics that are underneath the financial ecosystems. And by the way, the technology that is being built to try to move the finance. You see, that move the finance that right now that we're discussing, there is one note that we haven't touched, and this is the intermediary. The intermediary takes 30% of any funding that comes in, utilized for internal use, and then they utilize another 20% for technical technical support. Communities gets 50% of funding that comes into territory, and that 50% is not even finance. They're artifacts, they're items that they cannot even think about their own plant, how they should utilize those things. And we have multiple cases like this across the landscape of Latin America. And I think there is many initiatives right now, many of them that in the ground, they are looking alternatives. They're saying, when we mean direct finance, we mean we want to give them cash to the communities so they can think about how they want to utilize the cash. And then we start entering into sovereignty. And this is where, when Indigenous Commons, we start thinking about how do we reimagine the traceability of this funding. And we start engaging with biocultural MRB, meaning biocultural impact assessment that looks into, yes, ecological health, community health, but then how about the embodiment? We need to also look into the embodiment, which means our internal norms that we have made it as the rule of law to maintain balance, equilibrium, and create those agreements that doesn't mean paper. It means you are because I am. And that's the bigger question that we are trying to answer. And when we get to that point, is when we are holding autonomy, when they are holding sovereignty, when they are bringing negotiations to our space. And we need to start moving away from our own narrative. We ourselves are becoming victims of our own narrative. Because have you heard when we talk about indigenous people, we start with this, right? 80% of biodiversity in indigenous people. Poor indigenous people has only reached less than 1% of finance. Poor indigenous people. Right there, the word poor, it means that they don't have the capacity to manage their finance. Should be the other way around. It should be when only 1% of the global finance, indigenous people have managed the nature finance to a outstanding biocultural assets of global 80%. See, that is commonwealth sovereignty. Then you start looking at this differently. Because right now we see this. And myself, I fall in the trap. I have to think about it continuously. Am I following the same relic of talking indigenous people down as if they need a pat in the back? Good job. Very good that you take care of this forest. Now move aside. Now the expert has come in. Now we know what we do. Get away. Go to the urban area, get fat, get into drugs, get alcoholic, so we can continuously humanize you, and we continuously bring the poverty industry, and we will help you at some point. Thank you for your sovereignty. Bye-bye.
That's a beautiful transition into the next part, brother, and thank you for placing that. I'll hand it to you, Suzanne. Yeah.
I think there is a hand up.
James is perfectly timed with his hand up because we're going to actually invite questions right after the breakout room. So if you want to hold it, James, we're going through a little process here, but yeah, I love so much being on this call with both of you brothers, and especially when WariNkwi starts to get fired up, because it gets me fired up. And hopefully, we're going to go into a breakout room now, and afterwards we'll leave mics on for a second when you come in if you want to engage in some questions and dialogue with these great people. But we'd like you to have a chance to talk to each other too. One of our core principles is that relationality is essential to design and systems change. So we're sending you into breakout rooms. If you prefer to take a rest because you're an introvert or you just need a brain break, you can do that instead. Don't follow this link that you're about to receive. We are going to put a question in there to prompt you in case you need a little prompting, which is around Commonwealth sovereignty, which WariNkwi just brought up. And it's a question of, in your family or your community, are there ceremonies or rituals that bring people together to care for the natural world? Are there any things that you can think of? And you might have ways of getting creative with this. Like some of our older traditions that came from Europe, for example, were meant to be in care of the more than human world. So So we're going to put you in breakout rooms for about, 10 minutes. You'll come back. We're going to have a little more of dialogue, and then Jason's going to take it back over to close out the call with he and WariNkwi. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions on the other side. You're going to get a prompt on the screen that is inviting you to go into a breakout room. You have to click on that prompt. And if you want to stay out of it, you have to not click on that prompt. All right. Let's see who else is here. Everybody went in. Everybody went in except for, I think, sorry, I'm just checking here. Yeah, Kalia and Michael and Gio and Jessica are still with us here, I think. So I think people might be taking a break instead of being in their breakout rooms. I'll move Alex to be in a different room.
And speaking of those things, brother, when have you got any more news about when they want you to land in Aotearoa? Or we'll just have to manifest it ourselves. Yeah.
When will the condor touch down on Aotearoa?
Yeah.
Oh!
Forward to it. Oh, yeah. Because I just have a couple of, maybe we'll see. His brother's answering them anyway, but had two small questions to place if when we get that opportunity.
Yeah, great. Yeah, for you get to, yeah,
Yep. Yeah, I will. Yeah.
It's always nice when folks don't leave their breakout room right away. It means that they're having a good conversation, hopefully, and we're going to benefit from it. And
Yeah.
WariNkwi, I love the description of Commonwealth. That is just, yeah, bringing it right home. Just a reminder.
Yeah, you asked me to connect it, so we connected it.
Yeah, you did. Yeah. There he is, Mr. James, Mr. Escobedo, Mr. Papali, Mr. Roberts, Madam Bowles. We could say mix. I don't know who's gendered. I'm sorry if I misgendered anybody. Welcome back to our plenary room here. And yeah, we're interested to hear from you now. Did you have any interesting thoughts reflecting on the notion of Commonwealth, or any questions for Jason or WariNkwi? Please feel free to raise your hand and I'll invite you to speak, or drop something in the chat if you're feeling more comfortable communicating in the chat. So please feel free to go either way. Yes, Ben?
Re-enabled, Suzanne? I'm not sure it is.
You're a genius, Ben. Like I said, send me your invoice. Okay, the chat is now re-enabled. Thank God Ben was on this call. Yeah, now people get to notice each other in the room. So I guess I'll start with a little bit around, what do you mean when you say biocultural, WariNkwi? I get a sense, and I'm curious for folks who may be new to that term, how could we measure something that's biocultural?
There is three. Think about a Venn diagram for a minute. Just picture a Venn diagram, and then let's think about three things that works together. And primarily, let's just ground it in economy. Let's just think about economy as our nuclide to think about biocultural. Economy is dependent in nature and the culture. Culture is the people, the society, everything that makes this thing. And then everything that holds resource. Nature holds the resource, the land holds the resource. And if you want to run artificial intelligence successfully, well, guess what? You need land to have your data centers and bring the minerals to build the technology. So it's still very much so is there. And then the overlapping in here, think about institutions. Anything that has to do with either the rule of law, meaning that's inherent internalized norms that we make it as a rule of law. For instance, a rule of law before existence, the Supreme Court we still didn't go around killing each other, right? That was not just it didn't happen just because the Supreme Court said like, by the way, you should not kill the people. It was like no, it was internal normalized rule of law that we should not do harm to each other because we need each other. So that's the institution. So biocultural comes from that point that we need that nature part. That is the everything that has to do with the creation of life. So if we want to measure it, we can think about in biology sense, and that sense of biological sense. Anything that harnesses biological sense is going to create life if we create it. Then we can look into biodiversity. Everything that creates that diversity, that creates that abundance. And finally, we look into the cultural diversity. That will be the norms, the institutions, the creation of rule of law, how we want to interact, utilize the biodiversity is, if you will, and you are happy to disregard what I'm saying, but if you will, biodiversity is the product, is the asset product of biology, is what we end up seeing, where we look at it. A flower, a tree, a butterfly, an eagle, a fish, that comes from the biology, from the old creations of life. So if we want to look biocultural, we need to look into the biology, the biodiversity, and the cultural diversity. When we look all those three things, now that little Venn diagram overlaps, and what overlaps in between is what we might call it assets. What is the assets through which we can measure the impact? Meaning, right now we can actually measure biodiversity because we are seeing species declined due to either human induced or climate change due to human induced. Also, we can measure the cultural diversity change either by land disposition, by genocide, by the way, by homogenization of those diversity ethnic groups. We are seeing the loss. And it's surprising the following. To me, it's very surprising when I see this trajectory. In places where long ago there was a rich biodiversity and the diversity of cultures has demise, the biology itself has declined. So we see areas where there is no regeneration. There is not a lot of biodiversity holding this. And I walk across the Andes. Across the Andes, I have walked where long time ago used to be terraces or used to be plantation areas. Those areas has now regenerated by themselves when the native biodiversity, as is postulated by many research papers. They say that in given time, nature will regenerate by itself. But we are not seeing, at least in the Andes, we are not seeing that specific effect. We are actually seeing a lot of more, nature comes back, but not a functional nature, meaning a biodiversity nature that will make the ecosystem functional. Biocultural assets is trying to look into those things instead of right now what has happened is when the trade that is now established for nature assets is only accounting for the biodiversity. It's forgetting the biology and it's forgetting the cultural. Those two things, according to Armstrong, so if you don't believe me, let's go to look it up, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, and ask her. According to her, it says the power of local communities to establish institutionality autonomy makes that system more sustainable. That's not me. That's Eleanor Armstrong, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And I think when you get to the level, something of true you might be harnessing in there. So that's how I can explain what I think biocultural and how we might measure is through the assets, a biocultural assets.
Yeah, beautiful, Brother Navi, WariNkwi. And I want to say for everyone, when you look at the stars above us, the grand mothering constellation, for our ancestors, the stars were data. They were the map. Today, WariNkwi, you're building a biocultural MRV and AI systems. How do you ensure that these new tools possess the same condor knowing as those stars? How do we guarantee that our data remains a tool for liberation and doesn't become just another resource to be mined?
Okay, in a very superficial way, I can just say like indigenous data sovereignty in a very superficial way. Nothing becomes sovereign until is landed in the ground. Think about that. Nothing becomes sovereign until it's landed in the ground. Do you remember the conquest of the West in the United States? It was not United States until the flag was put in there and the land was claimed. Until then, it was just notions that it will be a colony or a free state, or it will enrich until it was landed. To do that, to actually maintain a data genealogy or data provenance, what we need to start doing is two things that I believe that could be very important. One is what we're doing when Indigenous Commons, a little bit. We are working into creating these biocultural labs or biocultural systems labs that are looking into what are communities doing when the technologies that they have right now, what they are doing right now successfully when what they have at hand. Instead of asking the question, how will technology support communities? No, we are looking at what are communities doing successfully right now and how communities will look when the technology is introduced. How they will use it. To do this part is where we are seeing that we are not collaborating. We are a social species, but surprisingly, we are not collaborating in this meta crisis. So data centers, for instance, the data center itself is very far away from the territories where the data is produced. The technology, like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, synthetic biology, all those things that are meant for social good, they are harnessed in institutions when closed doors that prevents communities from asking questions or using them for stewardship. What if, and this is something that we're exploring in the Andes, what if we were to build a small data repositories across indigenous territories? And these small data repositories is linked to the internet. And in there, what happens is that we are starting adding label and notices in our data genealogy. What data standards or what data should be used to help us understand climate change? Should be used to help us understand how do we create relational economical goods and services? What data does help us to create that level of understanding? So we are building this because in Latin America, surprisingly enough, we don't have a data center in Latin America. So we are dependent on whatever economical, financial, climate model is built outside Latin America. So in a way, it's kind of a proxy to what is happening. But one of the things that I have been talking with native bio consortia here in the United States, they are building a tribal data repository to handle tribal data that will be able to have metadata from their own communities, their worldviews, their own knowledge systems, their own language. And in that sense, you see that data is no longer about validation by the weird system. It's not about that validation. So inherently, by design, you're already creating the conditions for us not to need to talk about liberation, decolonization. No, we are now talking about the exercise of sovereign use of our information, of our ways of understanding how our ecosystems are doing. So it's not just us that we think in this, we are thinking a very small scale because what we want to do is instead of creating something massive, we want to create in in the Andes of Ecuador, one data repository, and then in the north, central, and south, and that connects to the north, central, and south of the Amazon. And those data speak to each other. And the way that they speak to each other is that we are not understanding our trading agreements between our own territories. And the data could be this retooling of trading agreements. So biocultural MRB could be the instrument to help us understand how we exchange data, what kind of data is being exchanged. But we are exchanging it through our own methodology, through our own data standardization, through our own mechanisms. Now, when I say our own, and here is when I lose a lot of people from outside indigenous ecosystems. Here is where everybody say like, why? Now you're talking about division. Now you're talking about dividing us, indigenous and non-indigenous. Now you just propheticizing this thing. When I mean in our methodology is means we are maintaining the provenance, the metadata of how the data, once standardized, can enter and participate in the larger market economic data. Because right now what is happening, if you notice, we're integrating indigenous knowledge. How? How are you really integrating indigenous knowledge? Is there a standard? Is there a way to aggregate, disaggregate the data, reaggregate? What happens when we put to artificial intelligence, which actually what artificial intelligence is like a laundry. It's a knowledge laundering machine, because what it does is pattern recognition. Whatever sounds similar, it puts it together, and the output is not the same clothing that enter. Is a poncho. You put a t-shirt, now you have a poncho outside. Both are clothing, two different uses, but both are clothing, and people kind of satisfied when that. But now imagine if we had an indigenous data standard, which we're building right now in our ecosystem, that disaggregates the data into different classes of data according to data genealogies. Environmental data. What kind of data do we need in environment that comes from communities? Climate data. What kind of climate data do we need from indigenous people? Biocultural data, and here is where most people get lost also. In biocultural data, we talk about medicinal, spiritual, medicinal plants, soil, agricultural practices, the biocultural data, all those things that has to do related to the biology of things. We do not have a standard. Ethnobotany don't have a standard. Ethnobiology don't have a standard. Bioculture, nature-based solutions folks don't have a standard. But all of them, they working to integrate indigenous knowledge. How? Nobody can give a real answer. And primarily when we ask the question, how about intellectual property? How about them? Because right now we see many books being publicized in indigenous technology. Who holds the patent to that technology? If we talk about indigenous technology, who holds the design pattern? Nobody can give us an answer into that, because we haven't created that model for the community to govern the data. What we have done is cherry pick knowledges that we need. We have cherry pick knowledges that we need. Think about fire management. Do you remember how long fire management was ignored, was abused, was designed to say that these are people that do not know anything about forest management? Anybody remembers that? The era of time when fire management was like a savagery, like people when no notions of empirical knowledge. Have you read the recent papers of fire management? Anybody has read that? Everything is related to indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, including indigenous communities, including local communities. Still they don't say how the data is governed. Still they miss to say, hey, by the way, this community is the author of this technology in fire management. Instead, they say like, we discovered this practice.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem.
Right.
But I saw a hand. I will pass it a hand.
So I just want to say we have a couple of questions in the chat as well. I'm not sure, brother,
Okay.
if you saw those. So just want to make sure we're tracking that.
Rick, and then I will try to follow the
Yeah.
questions over here.
Yeah, thank you. We're very honored to be here and listen and learn.
and I was in a breakout with Ben, and kind of we slightly touched on this with the work I'm doing, and um, like there's these several steps to get to a commonwealth, the sovereignty you mentioned, and some of the work I've been doing and really proposing is like this piece around indigenous cultural safety that gets bypassed between any before any collaboration that happens, right? There's this understanding, there's people may have some history, but what has happened and because of Western research and institutions. So I feel like there needs to be education on that when you bring together folks in the same room and somehow like as the first steps. Um, and then what are protocols? Because there's protocols on both sides, the researchers and indigenous communities or tribal communities. So there's so much it gets bypassed where you don't get to this place of really being receptive to each other at times. So nothing's really established. There's no standardized way of really integrating iTech, and bits are taken up there. Just a few thoughts there. Thank you.
Yeah, but you see, this is what my colleagues remember what I say, embassies. We need a diplomatic benefit negotiation space, and that's the embassy. And indigenous people in our indigenous ecosystems, let's again bring a Venn diagram forward and let's think about this. Right now, there is the emergence of indigenous research methodology, right? There is emergence of that. There is many books and many articles being published. Then there is from the trying to break loose from this the worst tricksters history ever told scientific weird methodology. They are trying to break loose out of that through action research participation or participatory action research. So there is the other one. But we're missing one piece in between those two things. And that's what I call it a homo embodimenticus, the embodiment of our knowledge and practice, our position, our intentionality, and our potentiality of what we're doing. So we need to bring this next layer that is embodiment. We all, every single person in this blue-green planet, we are embedded to some form of culture, belief systems. Either this is the scientific culture, or either this is just the economical culture, the business culture. We are all embodying some beliefs, some culture science. So we need to bring that forward to really understand our embodied beliefs, biases, such that what Rick is mentioning, so we don't bypass them, but we rather reach to a level of creating this agreement during the embassy is where we'll bring those three layers. And in between is the embassy where we discuss freely and openly what we're doing. And this is what I believe, where my own group, Kinrai Hub, when Indigenous Commons, we have been entering into this embassy when we are. How do we bring these conversations across so we create the agreement that becomes a normative in the rule making? How that becomes that part through the participation, and we are exploring. Hopefully, in the next year, we will have more of this that we can publish more so in the language of how we might implement, because it's needed. The guidance is needed, and we need to provide some examples to make that. We are in the practice part in order to create the theory part. We need to practice it, create the theory, not the other way around, and we are in the interface. So hopefully that will help when some of the risk of Rick bringing in. I will connect very quickly to some of the questions in here. The indigenous, the indigenous data repository.
Just before that, brother. Just before that, I just, Rick, nami for that, and I'd like everyone, to invite you if you want to become kin makers or your guardians to reach out to us, and then we can talk more about the important things you placed there, Rick, and then because as Indigenous Commons, we do have a ceremonial approach with spirit-centered design. So really reach out, and this is why your ancestors have placed you here, because you have a role to play for your local community, for your regional community, and for the collective of us all working together. So thank you for that. And I'll put you back to WariNkwi for the questions. I think we had James and Ben had placed some.
I will start. I think Ben is the first one they have in here, and then I have James. And the tribal data repository is meant to be for North America. So that includes Canada. So if that becomes an interest, we can make the connection, or you can reach directly to them, because right now they are in the process of building the partnership. But that will be a good place to look a little bit farther away from moving from these big data centers into more holistic data centers. And this is the tribal data repository that they built intentionally for North America. Because we are not part of North America, we are envisioning a different model, but following the same approach, if you will. I will answer Michael in a minute. Let me just when James, do you have any questions before we? No, that was Suzanne asking a question. Algorithms. What about algorithms and the trained there? Okay. Algorithmics, actually, we could solve the problem of algorithms by the type of data and how we label. So if we think about AI governing systems, and AI governing systems, we kind of have about 6 branches that is identified in a way that we can look. And one of them is actually the data input. What kind of data is being input? What kind of data is coming in? So if we standardize our data and we clean the data in a way that is in the aggregation process can hold on the tags, that way we can actually break the AI bias. Because one of the things that we are not doing right now is breaking AI. We need to break it. So it's being redesigned through the metadata that we need AI to handle. We haven't done that because we don't have enough data to move it through the way. And one of those ways to actually do this is through small language models. And small language models can actually run in your desktop, can run in your cell phone. And it requires a very small RAM to run and test it. So in the Andes, we are looking into very small language models in order, we are not looking for revitalizing our language. We are way away from that. No, if we put our language into AI, we're feeding our source of power. Our language holds the law, holds the economy, holds the assets. What we need to be doing is interpret our language into written text, primarily of our laws or our customary laws, such that AI can be trained when customary laws to understand cost-benefit negotiations. So in the Andes, we are mostly focusing a small language model to feed them this information. And that way we can utilize the data to test it. And that way we can break it. And the other one in the parallel to the 6 areas that identify is the user, is the end user. So the end user also needs to understand what is feeding and what is asking to the model. So if we do a clear understanding of digital literacy when the users of this small language model, we can actually create a small prompt engineers that it can feed into this model and clean the model of biases. Now, when I mean clean the model of biases, it means cleans the model of biases internally. That does not mean the bias is not going to be externally. Somebody using from the external point will see it as bias to their culture. So we need to make that very clear that the bias is more internal, not necessarily external. And I think when that, Michael.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone, really, for being here, creating community, for the aspiration to bring attention to other ways of knowing that presently are hidden in plain sight often. I find myself struggling with, I was recently speaking to a group of AI researchers about how other ways of doing AI one of the things that I'm hearing throughout this conversation is a kind of mechanized, if we simply put the content into the tools of this way of describing the world, this way of mapping, this language, if we just put it all into English and we get all the parts in English properly, we will have quote unquote solved the problem. And I wanted to be a little oppositional about that, because the place, for one, living systems, memory doesn't work like a computer, right? You don't build a database, you don't populate it. There is memory distributed at many different layers of a system that know many different things. So whether the knowledge is in the humans, whether the knowledge is in other parts, there's a different way of both paying attention to what there is to learn, and then being right. And I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the quest to translate it into English, to use that metaphor, surrenders all the wisdom that is not in those ways of describing it. So I just want to invite a resistance to not be too willing to make it accessible to what the English speakers want, because the English speakers don't know what is not in English. Yeah, I think that's my comment.
That's a very important point. That's one of the things I'm saying, like, we need to standardize the data, because I'm not saying that the solution is going to be in translating our knowledge into English and that will solve the problem. But what will happen is, right now, the way that research, development, and innovation is taking place and trying to incorporate, include indigenous knowledge, is doing it in a way that is utilizing everything that comes in the language that's being described, or everything that is being filmed, or everything that is being captured. And that way, what is happening is then we run this very particular danger of what is sacred, what is confidential, and what must never be digitized, what must exist in relationship between the intergenerational responsibility. But what I'm trying to propose in here, if anything, is if we are forced to participate in this way of existence within the new digital transformation encounter, well, if we are forced to do so, do we resist and become the obstacle and being abused because we resisting into this? Or do we propose alternative ways that at the very least comes from our building that help us have more control on what sorts of data we are willing to move through the pipeline, instead of right now where we are. Nonetheless, we are the open data source. We are entering into the tragedy of the commons, because the institutionality of who controls the data, who can capture the data, is completely skewed to the individuals that holds this machinery as a whole. But we haven't been able to counteract into this world, the worst tricksters history ever told of technology, that is telling us that this will be solving. But in the meantime, it is creating more issues. But that is a very important moral and ethical discussion that we are to discuss more in depth when the same communities that may or may not want to participate at all. And that is the important piece, that they need to actually understand not the benefits and the costs, but rather the ramifications and the implications of what this will take into doing this way. And as the other question, right? Should we even standardize it, or should we keep it that way as it is right now? That will also be a valid question to ask. But we are playing both opportunities to think about, if community is sovereign, they say, we want to remain in this ecosystem in the way that we are. That to us is at least a sovereign decision that they are making. versus being imposed by the collection of the information that they do not want to be sharing. So there is this discussion that needs a profounder work, and we just starting. This conversation just has begun, so we don't know what it will look like in the next year and the coming years.
Thank you. I realize we're almost at the end, so if I was going to offer an anecdote that would be difficult, but I'm just as happy to be quiet and return so we can wrap up the meeting.
Well, why don't you feel free to drop it in the chat, Michael, if it's possible. And I see James
has an anecdote. It's an anecdote. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Another time. Another time.
Type out an anecdote.
James, please.
Oh, you're on. Let me unmute you, James. There you go.
Okay. I was saying that I really wholeheartedly agree with everything I said here, except for one point. And I think it's key. You're using the word sovereignty in the way of trying to reclaim it for Indigenous culture. It cannot be reclaimed for Indigenous culture. It did not originate with Indigenous culture. The word sovereignty it originated with the colonial powers. It goes back to the kingly era of liberalism, prior to liberalism. That's the sovereign idea of kings that was incorporated by national sovereignty. And now, so what I'm suggesting is simply that to improve the rigorous epistemology that you're already developing, just find another word like you are using, embodied or intrinsic or some other word for sovereign. Because what's happening is, as a result of Indigenous peoples who were former colonies becoming liberated in order to develop in the new international system, they have to agree to borrow for their development based on sovereign debt that banks and corporations already trade in. So in other words, they have to join the sovereign system, and they surrender their power to the sovereign wealth that's already out there. And the same thing has to do with liberalism inventing the coined the term commonwealth. So I don't see it as a matter of recapturing commonwealth sovereignty. I see it as something entirely different than that, because it confuses the language and it gets tripped up. And I can tell you that if you want this to go to the level of negotiations at a higher level, and I was at COP30, I saw that there were no Indigenous people in the blue zone at all.
I was not there, unfortunately.
If you want to really engage in those negotiations, don't use the word commonwealth or sovereignty.
Respectfully, you shouldn't be telling him what to do or not do. Your point is valid, but
okay. This is part of why in the past sessions we were keeping the speakers off. We have a vast range of difference of opinion on these conversations, and we do tend to promote a tone of curiosity and requesting. And also, yeah, so I just want to honor, thank you, Kalia, for making that invitation, that we want to be in a place of curiosity and asking and inviting question. And also, James, something that comes from a very passionate heart, a question of like, why would we be, redoing the language of the oppressive, theater that we're engaged in? So normally in a moment like this, Indigenous Commons would go into like a caring and nurturing huddle to have a discussion around our principles, around how we discuss things with each other. Unfortunately, this is a webinar with 1 minute left. So I really want to say, if anyone wants to stay an extra 15 minutes to have an experience of going through tension navigation, we'd welcome that. And I'm going to hand it to my brother Jason because I have full trust, and WariNkwi, back to you because I have full trust that you will do what is needed to do. And if you need to go a few minutes over, that's totally fine as well. So thank you to all of you.
Yeah, and feeling in the spirit of these things, what we're doing was we'd moved from stillness to design to protection, and then in terms of WariNkwi around this ambiguity around sovereignty, because a grandmothering constellation doesn't just stay in communication of language and the distillery of thoughts of man and woman. It's incorporating everyone to have a balance. It's been really wonderful to hear these things, because one of the things I'm talking for my sacral now is the health of ourselves, so everyone. So what I felt is a little disruption with one's wairua, what we say in Māori, your balance within yourself. And so we honor that, and we take that on board, because that's very important, because the health of our communities, our people, our decision makers, our ones who will contribute to the decision making is very important. So WariNkwi, would you like to give a little bit of like a 30-second placement of what you were placing today, and then I'll close it off respectfully for everyone for their health and well-being.
Yeah, it's always a new venture to speak in front of many diverse, experienced folks, and that's the journey that we take. And we just started the conversation, and this is the beginning of many discussions. As I was mentioning in my conversation, we often are not collaborating in these spaces, and as I see in the chat, there is many overlaps of people knowing, people working in these data repositories or trying to really look into the AI governing systems. And I think this is opportunities where we connect and we start fine-tuning the links and the opportunities that we see, and trying to break loose from these colonial relics that we are still hold on. And that's completely fine, as long as we are aware of the colonial relics that exist and how we try to find pathways to break loose out of that. I think is a beautiful journey. And Indigenous Commons, as we are in Kinraihof, we are in this process of continually evolving the system and not talking about systems change, mostly because it becomes a program, more like a roadmap of how we do this. But how do we come together and envision this? And that has been a journey, a passion. And very much thank you for the questions, for being here, for paying attention closely. There is still some questions in there, but if you haven't, follow me in LinkedIn. We post a lot of our work in there to find what else we're building, either in the infrastructure or in the language. But also just reach out when anything that comes to mind that might be of interest and might be a point of intersection to feed into the curiosity that we have to build better systems and really transform what we're trying to do. Napana alamu, and great to be here with all of you.
Yeah, Ngāmihi, brother. And so I'll close it off. This is an ancient karakia in terms of the relationship of all of us. So, tihei mauri ora, e whakawhetai ana mō tēnei rā, he whakamau maharaki nā taonga tuku iho. Nā maunga, nā awa, nā moana, nā rākau, nā manu, hei tiritiri mō tātou katoa, o tātou wairua te hanga tangata kotahi. Kia mahi taki ai mō te au, tino pai, humi e, hui e, taehi e. And loosely translated, the life force of us all combined, we give thanks for this day. We remember the treasures that have been passed on. The mountains, the rivers, the seas, the trees, the birds are there for all of us to share. Our aim should be to build these love friendships so that we may work together for a better world, united together, united as one. Kia ora whānau, and have a great day. Ngā mihi.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, WariNkwi. Thank you, everyone who showed up. Is there anyone who's having a longing to do like a tension navigation circle about the final moments of our call? I'm happy to hold space for that if you'd like. Okay, if not, we'll see you on that. Michael, hi, Michael, go ahead.
I have to wrap.
Do you
so
need
thank you.
that?
WariNkwi.
Adios.
No, I'm
Okay.
fine. I trust my brothers can take, you know, whatever's coming at them. They're strong too. So, but I just wanted to be here in case anybody. Okay, I'll reach out to all of you in an email. You'll be receiving an email with the recording from the call. And I just want to say thank you very much for all of you who stand in the light of dignity and care. And yeah, we're all in this together. So we'll talk to you soon.